The Veil and the Flute, Mirabai's Journey to Divine Love. Episode 1. Born to Sing of Krishna. It was near the turn of the 16th century, traditionally placed around 1498, when a precious child was born into the royal Rathore family of Merta in the heart of Rajasthan. This girl, who would later be venerated across India as the extraordinary poet-saint Mirabai, opened her eyes in a land steeped in traditions of valor, rich with stories of great kings, fearless queens, and a tapestry of devotion that had already begun to shape a distinctive cultural and spiritual life throughout the subcontinent. The precise year of her birth remains a matter of academic inquiry. Historians have occasionally placed her birth anywhere between 1498 and the early 1500s. But in the popular imagination and in many hagiographic accounts, 1498 is taken as a symbolic year that captures the essence of the era, a time of political turbulence, of shifting dynasties, of the bhakti movement's expansion, and of remarkable spiritual fervor that brought poets and mystics to the fore. Mirabai's father was Ratan Singh Rathore, a respected Rajput noble of Merta, which lay under the larger political influence of the Rathore clan. Merta itself was a principality known for its strategic location and its robust warrior culture. Tales of Rajput valor, of horsemen in shining armor, and of fortress walls that defied sieges were part of the fabric of Mirabai's early life. The Rajputs upheld codes of honor, loyalty, and martial prowess. Royal weddings often took place among allied clans, forging and breaking alliances that could shape the future of kingdoms. Amid these worldly concerns, devotion to various deities was common, though it was the heroic tradition that seemed to define the worldview of many. Yet there was something different stirring in the cultural air. The Bhakti movement was in full swing, having gathered momentum from the teachings and poetry of figures such as Kabir, Ravidas, and other saints, whose words emphasized direct communion with the divine through love and devotion. This period saw an upsurge of saints and poets, both of the Nirguna tradition, those who worshipped a formless God, as with Kabir's emphasis on the ineffable, attributeless divine, and the Saguna tradition, those who adored specific forms or avatars of the divine, such as Krishna or Rama. In the north of India, especially in regions near Vrindavan, Mathura, and Rajasthan, Krishna devotion flourished, drawing from older Vaishnava traditions and interweaving with new, personalized expressions of surrender to God. Mirabai would become a shining star in this broadening universe of bhakti, although she was born into a family that by all external measures was quite traditional in Rajput custom. Her upbringing as a child, however, hinted from the start that she was unusually inclined towards spiritual matters. Stories that circulated in local lore mention that when she was just a small child, some versions say 4, others place her at 6, there came to her family's home a wandering sadhu, a mendicant singing songs in praise of the Lord. It is said that little Mirabai was deeply moved by the melody and devotion in his voice. Another common anecdote involves a small idol of Krishna brought by a visiting ascetic or relative. Mirabai, upon seeing this figure of Krishna, sometimes in stories it is the story of a wedding procession with a Krishna idol, was captivated beyond measure. She insisted that the deity was to be her eternal companion. These stories lay the foundation for Mirabai's unwavering devotion, as from the earliest days she saw in Krishna not merely a figure for ritualistic worship, but a beloved friend, confidant, and divine consort. This inclination of hers ran counter to many cultural expectations, not because devotion itself was frowned upon. Indeed, Rajput households venerated gods and goddesses regularly, but because Mirabai's style of devotion displayed an intensity that seemed to surpass the boundaries of family ritual. She was, in effect, claiming a personal relationship with Krishna that was more intimate than typical household piety. She saw in Krishna an object of her affection and spiritual surrender, a beloved who overshadowed all other pursuits. This early melding of romantic and spiritual longing found expression in the child Mirabai's words, as she would sing and dance for her Krishna, oblivious to the judgments of others. Yet, in telling Mirabai's story, one must also appreciate the broader spiritual context of the times. The Bhakti movement, particularly in northern India, had a strong foundation in both Nirguna and Saguna poetry. On the Nirguna side were saints like Kabir, who railed against the external trappings of religion, proclaiming the formless truth that resided within, beyond the boundaries of caste, creed, or established dogma. Another important figure in the Sant tradition was Ravidas, whose simple yet piercing verses taught that God was in everything and that social divisions were illusory. On the Saguna side, devotion to a personalized deity, often in the form of Krishna or Rama, saw luminaries like Surdas, Tulsidas, and many Vaishnava saints whose compositions brought the stories of divine avatars closer to the hearts of the people. In some narratives, Mirabai was influenced by, or even took as a guru, Ravidas, bridging the gap between Nirguna teachings of interior devotion and the Saguna worship of Krishna. There are hagiographic accounts claiming that Mirabai once sought out Ravidas, who recognized in her a sincere seeker, unshackled from worldly attachments, and blessed her to proceed on her path of single-minded surrender to Krishna. Although the exact historical meeting is debated, the symbolic significance is that Mirabai's devotion was simultaneously personal in her love for Krishna and universal in her disregard for caste and social barriers. In her father's household, Mirabai grew up with the typical luxuries of a princess. She had maids-in-waiting, precious ornaments, the best tutors in music and poetry, and all manner of princely amusements. Yet from a young age, she showed little interest in jewels, and even less interest in typical forms of entertainment. Instead, she revelled in singing, poetry, and the presence of sadhus or wandering minstrels. She would greet them with respect, offer them food or alms, and invite them to share stories of spiritual journeys. Her family tolerated this inclination of hers, sometimes even encouraging it in measured ways, since religious charity was not frowned upon. But the worry was always that Mirabai's heart seemed too captured by the spiritual realm. A princess was expected eventually to marry suitably, forge or strengthen alliances, and serve the lineage by bearing children. Some nights, young Mirabai would sit on the rooftop under the moonlit sky, gazing at the stars and softly chanting the name of Krishna. A sweet fragrance pervaded those hours of reflection. She began composing little songs, unpolished perhaps by the standards of the formal courtly tradition, but flowing with an innocence and devotion that would come to characterize her later poetry. She sang, "O Hari, you have taken my heart, a tender bloom offered at your feet. My eyes thirst for your vision day and night. Your name upon my lips is all I need." Her father and other elders at times overheard these verses and either marveled or worried. Marveled at the depth of feeling and worried about the ramifications for a princess living in a world bound by protocols. An unmarried girl of her age was not supposed to be so openly fixated on a deity as a romantic beloved. While devotion to Krishna as the beloved was a known tradition in bhakti circles, some traced it to the divine love of Radha Krishna described in ancient texts. Seeing it so openly in a princess was unnerving in a conventional household. Around this time, events in and around Merta shaped the political environment. There were alliances to be made with the Sisodia clan, who ruled the kingdom of Mewar from the seat of Chittorgarh. The Sisodias were one of the oldest and most respected lineages of Rajputs, tracing their ancestry to legendary heroes. Marriage alliances between the Rathors and the Sisodias could cement stronger ties in an era when the regional sultanates and eventually the Mughals were vying for power. So, it did not come as a surprise when Mirabai's family began to plan a marriage for her. She was, after all, of marrying age in that cultural context, though still very young in modern reckoning, perhaps in her early teens. The proposed match was Bhoj Raj, the crown prince of Mewar, son of Rana Sanga, Sangram Singh, the powerful and respected ruler of Mewar. Mirabai, for her part, seemed unenthused by the prospect of worldly marriage. In some retellings, she is said to have questioned her mother or father, but I am already wedded to Krishna. Who else can I marry? This question, while childlike, carried a spiritual weight. She had internalized Krishna so profoundly that the notion of a worldly husband felt secondary, if not entirely irrelevant. Yet, in the social order of the time, such a statement would be dismissed as an innocent fancy. One account suggests that her mother, sometimes it is said it was her mother, at other times a female guardian, told her gently that the idol of Krishna she cherished was indeed her beloved, but in a symbolic sense. Her real marriage, she was told, must be with a flesh-and-blood prince. After all, she was Rajput royalty, and her duty was to serve her clan and her father's alliances. As the negotiations proceeded, Mirabai's father, Ratan Singh, decided that marrying her to Bhoj Raj of Mewar was indeed the best political step. He also believed that Mirabai, as she matured, would adapt to the new household, and that perhaps the blessings of her beloved Krishna would keep her content. For Mirabai, the event felt like a formality, a stage in life she must traverse, but it did not carry with it the emotional significance that others attach to marriage. She was wise enough to sense the complexities of her father's position, and she was also gentle and obedient in her own way. Despite her spiritual preoccupation, she showed deep respect for familial bonds, and so the wedding was planned and would unfold with the pomp and grandeur befitting a royal alliance. Before the wedding, however, certain pivotal events took place. The stories vary in detail, but there is a widely recounted tale about Mirabai's mother or aunt, depending on the version, explaining to her the concept of the groom. Mirabai asked, "Who is my groom?" In the mind of the child saint, that question had already been answered. Krishna was her eternal husband, but in the eyes of society, her groom was Bhoj Raj of Mewar. In one telling, Mirabai's mother, to appease her, pointed to the image of Krishna. The mother might have jokingly said, "This idol of Krishna is your groom," never suspecting that these words would become carved into Mirabai's heart. From that point on, Mirabai began to treat the deity as her wedded husband. Whether or not this story is historically accurate, it captures a deeper truth about Mirabai's psyche. For her, Krishna's presence was both literal and personal. The point of tension would come when she was made to marry a mortal prince, while her heart already belonged elsewhere. Meanwhile, from a broader perspective, the bhakti movement's impetus was spreading not just among the lower castes or village folks, but increasingly in royal courts as well. Princes and nobles were discovering that such devotion could inspire and unify their subjects. In the larger tapestry of Indian spiritual life, the teachings of Nirguna saints like Ravidas, who allegedly lived around the same time, were filtering into households and communities. Ravidas spoke of God's oneness, free from the limitations of name, form, caste, or creed. Mirabai's devotion to Krishna was more aligned with Saguna worship, but she carried in her heart a radical inclusiveness reminiscent of Nirguna teachings. She was rumored to respect sadhus from all walks of life. Caste distinctions, for instance, mattered little to her. In one story, she would seat a saint considered untouchable by the norms of the day in her courtyard and personally serve him food, a gesture unimaginable for many aristocratic women. Thus, Mirabai was, from an early age, a spiritual phenomenon that others around her could not fully grasp. She was to be married into the Sisodia clan, and her father prepared the dowry and the gifts to be exchanged, while Mirabai prepared her mind for what she saw as a temporary arrangement. Overhearing the wedding preparations, she might have sung a verse to Krishna. "Dark One, my mother's house readies my bridal garb, but I have already adorned my soul for your sake. No veil can hide my longing for you, no gold can compare with the glow of your name." This tension between the worldly obligations imposed by her birth and her inner calling as a devotee would define Mirabai's journey. But for the time being, she would step into the role that destiny had laid out. Unbeknownst to her, she was about to walk through corridors of power and face the austere demands of a martial royal clan, all while kindling her inner flame of devotion quietly composed in the corner of the palace. In the interim, life continued at Myrta with its daily rhythms. The hustle and bustle of preparations for a royal wedding filled the air. Dancers and musicians were summoned to train or to perform. Artists were commissioned to decorate the halls. The smell of special sweets, of incense and fresh flower garlands permeated the palace. Yet Mirabai, more often than not, could be found in the temple portion of the household, seated before her beloved Krishna, offering him a single flower or singing him a new composition. Even in the midst of such grandeur, she found her retreat in those intimate moments. Sometimes tears of longing would run down her cheeks, tears of a deep separation from the object of her devotion. Other times, a gentle smile would grace her face, as if she heard the flute of Krishna calling her from beyond the horizon. In quiet corners of Murta, older women might whisper, "That girl is touched by the divine. She's not meant for ordinary domestic life." Others shrugged it off as a childish phase. Little did they know that these whispered prophecies would someday ring true throughout the land, that Mirabai's songs would be carried from village to village, temple to temple, across centuries. But for now, the child princess was about to step onto a larger stage. The match with the Sisodia prince meant she would move to Mewar, to Chittagong, one of the most formidable forts in Rajasthan, where her in-laws were known as among the fiercest defenders of Rajput independence and honor. There, in an environment charged with courtly intrigue, military concerns, and intense familial expectations, Mirabai's devotion would only grow stronger, setting the stage for the conflicts and challenges that would soon follow. In the concluding days leading up to her departure, Mirabai is said to have composed a hauntingly beautiful verse that, in one translation, reads, "I have given up worldly attachments. I have tied my heart to the anklets of the Lord. In the drumbeat of life, I hear only his flute. In the swirl of veils, I see only his form. O friend, how can I speak of another marriage when in my soul Krishna's presence reigns supreme?" Those around her might have thought these lines were the innocent imaginings of a bride-to-be. Some thought it was a form of pious decoration for her new life, a sweet expression that she might share in public gatherings to highlight her devotion. But they had yet to realize the depth to which Mirabai's vow went, how unwavering she was in her spiritual vision. These verses would resurface time and again, pointing to the single-mindedness that defined Mirabai's entire existence. She belonged to Krishna, heart and soul, from infancy until her last breath on earth. It is in this swirl of daily rites, wedding preparations, and quiet nights spent in devotion that episode 1 of Mirabai's story draws to a close. She is about to embark upon a path that will define her entire legacy. The child who once asked, "Who is my groom?" was about to have that question answered in two ways, one by the demands of her Rajput family, and another by the unbreakable bond of her heart with Lord Krishna. Unbeknownst to those around her, Mirabai was already forging a new kind of womanhood in her mind, one that would transcend the boundaries of clan and gender, and pave the way for a new expression of bhakti that continues to resound across centuries. Episode 2. Princess of Mewar, Servant of Krishna. When Mirabai arrived at the great fort of Chittagong, she was entering one of the most storied locales in Rajput history. The Sisodia rulers of Mewar had a reputation for valiant resistance against invasions, most notably those from the Delhi Sultanate and eventually the Mughals. Rana Sanga, Bhoj Raj's father, was already famed for his battles and alliances, forging paths that would either strengthen or weaken Mewar's hold on its vast region. Chittagong, with its towering walls, numerous gates and grand palaces, could overwhelm any newcomer. The wind at dusk carried echoes of heroic ballads and the memory of battles fought on these ramparts. The inhabitants took pride in their cultural heritage, their patronage of the arts, and their unswerving dedication to the Rajput code of honor. Mirabai, though young and newly wed, walked through these corridors with poise. Hers was not the naive awe that many young brides might display. She was respectful, yes, but her real gaze, so to speak, was turned inward, toward Krishna, whose idol she had carried with her. Upon settling into her quarters in the palace, the first thing she reportedly did was establish a small personal shrine where she placed her beloved idol. In so doing, she signaled that her relationship with her deity would not be relegated to a secondary status, that her devotion would continue as it had in Murta. Her husband, Bhoj Raj, by many accounts, was a brave and somewhat tolerant man, though perhaps not entirely prepared for the intensity of Mirabai's spiritual life. In some oral traditions, it is said he came to respect her devotion, even admire it, though he may have initially misunderstood it. He might have thought that as time passed, Mirabai would adjust to the normal routines of conjugal life, mingling devotion with the duties expected of a Rajput princess. As the new daughter-in-law, she was expected to engage in certain tasks within the zanana, the women's quarters, and follow instructions from her mother-in-law and father-in-law. However, Mirabai's daily routine remained centered around her worship, her singing, and her contemplation. Mirabai's mother-in-law, often depicted as a stern matriarch, was puzzled by this bride's habits. A princess was supposed to maintain decorum, appear at certain functions, dress in fine clothes, and adorn herself with jewelry that symbolized her family's prosperity. But Mirabai often rose before sunrise, bathed, put on simple garments, and lost herself in kirtan, devotional singing. She invited sadhus to the palace courtyard to sing the praises of Krishna, feeding them and seeking their blessings. This behavior soon became a source of tension in the Sisodia household. Royal women typically did offer charity, but not in such an unrestrained manner. The presence of wandering ascetics in the palace was cause for alarm, especially if they came from unknown backgrounds. The mother-in-law feared that Mirabai's conduct might tarnish the dignity of the royal family and that rumors could spread about her. Yet Mirabai could not be dissuaded from her calling. If asked why she persisted, she might have answered with a verse like, "Why should I hide my love for Krishna? The more I veil it, the hotter the flame grows within. I have tasted the nectar of his name, and now no worldly wine can intoxicate me so." In time, the tensions in the palace escalated. Some family members misread Mirabai's devotion, believing she might be infatuated with a mortal rather than a deity. Others accused her of neglecting her wifely duties, but there were also those who saw a pure sincerity in her eyes, an otherworldly glow that indicated a saintly disposition. She would often remain silent in the face of rebuke, responding only with humility. She might say, "Forgive me, mother, father, sisters-in-law, but my heart belongs to Giridhara, a name for Krishna. He is my refuge." This unwavering stance put her at odds with a social order that demanded her compliance first as a royal daughter-in-law, and only after that as a devotee in her private life. Bhoj Raj, seeing the friction, attempted to mediate. In some retellings, he quietly supported Mirabai's devotion, giving her a separate space in the palace to conduct her prayers and sing. He recognized something extraordinary about her. Certain stories describe how Mirabai would frequently go to the temple of Krishna within the fort of Chittagong, singing in ecstatic devotion, drawing crowds from both the palace and the surrounding community. People were mesmerized by her voice, by the lyrical quality of her poems, and by the depth of emotion that emanated from her entire being. This might have caused concern in the royal quarters. What if the princess was seen publicly mingling with commoners in the temple courtyard? Still, Mirabai's artistry, her poetic compositions, began to spread beyond the palace walls. She was known to compose spontaneously, turning her heartfelt devotion into lyrics that soared on the wind. "I call only one name in the desert of this world, Govind, Govind, Govind. In the scorching heat of desire and fear, he alone pours the cool water of grace. Where can I go, friend, but to his feet? He is the cloud in my drought, the spring in my soul." Such verses captured the sense of longing, the predicament of a soul in the arid landscape of worldly attachments. As word of her poetic genius spread, other devotees and poets began to gather near Chittagong. For some, Mirabai became a revered figure, an example of unwavering devotion. For others, especially in her own household, she was a curiosity or even a cause for anxiety. The eldest members of the family, including Rana Sanga, expected that once Mirabai settled into her married life fully, she would be an asset to the Sisodia lineage. They might have hoped her poetic skill and devotion could be used in times of public gatherings, but they did not foresee or condone her forging an identity that transcended her role as a princess. Over time, Mirabai began to experience a series of personal awakenings. She felt Krishna's presence not just in the idol, but in the very fabric of her being. It was around this period that she encountered saints and ascetics who further inspired her. Ravidas's name appears in many accounts, though historians debate whether she actually met him physically or was simply influenced by his teachings. The hagiographic version proclaims she took Ravidas as her guru, receiving from him the mantra of divine love that erased social distinctions. If this indeed occurred, or if Mirabai drew on Ravidas's teachings indirectly, the impact was profound. Ravidas, who came from a community deemed untouchable in that era, taught that God dwells in every being, rendering all external classifications meaningless. This radical perspective resonated with Mirabai's direct experience of Krishna's love, which she felt encompassed all. In her poetry, traces of that egalitarian spirit sometimes appear. The Lord does not ask of your caste or name, nor does he weigh your gold or crown. He searches for the lamp of love within, shining bright in the dark night of the soul. When conflict rose in the palace, Mirabai often responded with humility and poetry rather than anger or rebellion. In some stories, her sister-in-law or another palace woman would taunt her, accusing her of disgracing the family. Mirabai would quietly bow her head, then later sing to Krishna of how only he understood her, how only he recognized the purity of her love. The young princess grew into a woman whose entire being radiated devotion, unconcerned with worldly praise or blame. She was known to wear simple clothes, sometimes white or saffron garments, more akin to those of a renunciant than a queen. And when she danced in the temple courtyard with the common people, it was not to flaunt her disregard for convention, but simply because the ecstasy of Krishna's presence allowed no barrier between her and fellow devotees. Meanwhile, the political climate around Mewar was fraught. Rana Sanga was engaged in campaigns that would ultimately define the fate of the region against advancing powers. Bhoj Raj, as heir, had responsibilities that increasingly drew him away from the palace. The wars and alliances that shaped Mewar's destiny were ongoing, and the court was abuzz with strategic planning. But Mirabai remained mostly apart from these activities, seldom consulted for political matters. After all, she was a woman in a patriarchal society, and her role was expected to be primarily domestic. However, the moral and emotional climate in Chittagong was now enveloped by the presence of this princess saint, whose songs captured the imagination of many, especially the ladies of the court, some of whom began to admire her open-hearted devotion. The seeds of conflict were sown, however, by her refusal to observe strict boundaries in interacting with people from all backgrounds. She treated saints and devotees of Krishna as honored guests, even if they were from castes or communities that the Sisodius considered inferior. She gave away her possessions to such visitors, offering them clothes or jewels, not for their material worth, but as an act of service to her lord's devotees. This generosity annoyed some members of the family, who worried about the depletion of royal treasures and the subversion of hierarchical norms. They believed that Mirabai should concentrate on producing heirs, strengthening alliances, and upholding the dignity of the Sisodia name. The tension continued to mount until a tragic turn of events. Bhoj Raj, her husband, fell ill or was wounded in battle, accounts vary, and died relatively young. His death cast a shadow of mourning across the palace. Mirabai, still relatively young, was left a widow. In Rajput tradition, a widow was expected to live a secluded life, adhering to strict rules of mourning, sometimes even taking part in practices that further limited her role in society. But Mirabai's devotion to Krishna surged forward, almost as though the departure of her husband allowed her to focus entirely on her one true beloved. In some stories, she lamented Bhoj Raj's passing, not out of romantic love for him, but out of compassion and respect for a man who had, in his own way, allowed her some freedom in her devotion. She might have sung, "When I gazed into his eyes, I saw only your reflection, Girdhar. Now those eyes are closed, leaving me with your name alone. Yet I weep, for he was kind to your servant, and in his passing the world feels a little colder." Grief mingled with relief, perhaps, for now she was unshackled from the basic conjugal expectations. But the Sisodia family was not about to give her free rein. A widow still had obligations and was expected to behave in accordance with norms that honored her late husband and his lineage. The mother-in-law, already disapproving of Mirabai's ways, grew increasingly vocal. Rumors and hostility began to swirl. Some members of the palace whispered that Mirabai was possessed by illusions or that she had no sense of shame. Others whispered that she was a saint, far above common understanding, and that the family should heed her wisdom. Amid this evolving drama, Mirabai's devotion drew more attention from outside the palace. Devotees who admired her poems came seeking her blessings or counsel. Women from the town came hoping to sing with her in the temple or just to gaze upon her face, believing she was a true lover of Krishna whose sight might awaken their own devotion. Mirabai was no longer just a princess or a widow. She was fast becoming a spiritual figure revered by the local populace. This, in turn, intensified the family's alarm, for they saw in her rising fame a potential threat to their image. The mother-in-law and other elders of the family called upon Mirabai to cease her public singing and renounce her gatherings with wandering ascetics. They wanted her to behave like a proper widow of the Sisodia clan, wearing only white, secluding herself from public life, refraining from any form of self-expression that might be deemed unorthodox. Mirabai, however, refused to comply with these constraints. She believed she was fulfilling her dharma by serving Krishna. Earthly conventions were secondary. The real measure of duty, in her eyes, was to remain steadfast in her bhakti, devotion. One can only imagine how the palace corridors felt thick with tension, how Mirabai's songs must have echoed in the night as a gentle but persistent challenge to the very structure of aristocratic norms. Perhaps her mother-in-law or other relatives confronted her. She might have replied, in essence, "I have a husband who can never die, Lord Krishna. What have I to do with these customs of widowhood?" That statement, interpreted literally by the family, seemed scandalous. Interpreted spiritually, it was a powerful testament to her unwavering devotion. The friction would not subside. Some even plotted to rid themselves of Mirabai, for they believed she brought dishonor or was drawing public attention in ways that might weaken the Sisodia seat. Later, hagiographic accounts tell of attempts to poison her, to send her a basket with a snake concealed inside, or to arrange accidents in hopes of ending her life. Whether these stories are exact historical events or symbolic narratives, they reflect the intense pushback Mirabai faced. One version recounts that a cup of poison was given to her under the guise of prasad, holy offering, yet when she drank it, she remained unharmed. Miraculously, the poison was transmuted into nectar by Krishna's grace. In response to these mortal threats, Mirabai reportedly sang, "They offered me poison in a jeweled cup. The Lord's name was my shield and my cure. In the darkest pit, I found his guiding light, and the serpent's fangs were softened into flowers." Such legends serve not only as signs of her reputed saintliness, but also as metaphors for her ability to transform hostility and suffering into deeper devotion. The Sisodia palace grew increasingly uneasy about these miraculous tales, for they only heightened her reputation as a true devotee of the Lord. Eventually, it became clear that Mirabai could not coexist peacefully in a household that demanded she forsake her public displays of worship and adopt a life of silent widowhood. The seeds of her eventual departure from Mewar were being sown, and her name was beginning to spread beyond the confines of Chittagong, traveling wherever devotional singing was cherished. While these tensions boiled across North India, the bhakti movement continued to flourish. Saints sang in marketplaces, in temples, and under banyan trees, drawing men and women from all walks of life into a shared bond of devotion that often challenged the rigid hierarchies of caste and creed. The Nirguna saints, who believed in a formless God, and the Sagana saints, who adored specific deities, were united in their emphasis on direct experience of the divine through love, chanting, and self-surrender. Mirabai, through her unwavering love for Krishna, became a shining exemplar of Saguna Bhakti, though she carried an undercurrent of the Nirguna inclusivity that recognized the oneness underlying all forms. Rumors reached the corridors of the Sisodia palace that Mirabai might soon renounce her claims as a princess altogether, giving herself fully to the path of a mendicant or a traveling devotee. The mother-in-law, father-in-law, and other relatives tried to bring her to heel, threatening her with dire consequences if she disobeyed. But Mirabai, though gentle, was unbreakable in her resolve. She sang, "What can they take from me, who have nothing but your name? My jewels are worthless before your lotus feet. Let them chain my hands. My heart will still be free, for the one who owns my heartbeat dwells within." These verses capture her state of mind. Externally, she was confronted with hostility and constraints, but internally, she was united with Krishna. No worldly power, no threat or punishment could sever that connection. It was around this time, in many accounts, that she decided she could no longer remain in Mewar under such circumstances. She had lost her husband, her freedom was curtailed, and her life was in danger. Moreover, she felt a strong pull to live fully in devotion, to spend her days among saints and devotees, to visit the holy places associated with Krishna, especially Vrindavan and Mathura, the legendary lands of Krishna's childhood and youth. The sense of Vrindavan as the spiritual abode where the Ras Leela, divine dance, of Krishna and the gopis took place held an irresistible attraction for Mirabai's heart. And so the stage was set for her departure from Chittorgarh. This moment, though it might not have been a single dramatic event, was a turning point that would shape the remainder of her life. She would become not just a devout princess, but a wandering poet saint, whose songs carried the fragrance of divine love beyond the boundaries of royal palaces, into the villages and towns, into the hearts of common people who yearned for the Lord's grace. Her example would not only challenge the patriarchy of her time, but also illuminate the path for countless devotees who believed that the love of God transcended all social obligations. Thus, episode 2 of Mirabai's life draws to a close with her teetering on the brink of leaving the Sisodia court behind. She had faced the sorrow of losing her husband, the bitterness of familial opposition, and even attempts on her life. Yet none of these obstacles could quench her devotion, which burned more brightly than ever. She had found in Krishna an eternal companion, a divine protector who shielded her soul from the poisons and perils of the world. By this point, her name was already etched in the annals of bhakti poetry, a name that would resonate for centuries to come. The Princess of Mewar was about to become the wandering mendicant, the living embodiment of Krishna's gopi, the poetess whose voice would echo through temples, towns, and farmland across generations. Episode 3. The Trial of Love. After emerging from the fortress walls of Chittorgarh, Mirabai stepped onto a path that would take her through forests, across dusty roads, and into the hearts of India's spiritual landscape. She had chosen to leave behind the comforts and constraints of royal life, embracing instead the uncertain existence of a pilgrim. Her departure from Mewar was not a sudden flight in the dark, as some dramatic stories suggest. Rather, it was the culmination of mounting tensions and a profound realization that her calling lay beyond the palace gates. Once free from the Sisodia household, Mirabai might have first journeyed to nearby temples, seeking the company of other devotees who sang the praises of Krishna. She carried with her only the bare essentials, a few simple garments, her cherished idol of Krishna, and the unceasing song in her heart. The transformation from princess to wandering saint did not happen overnight, but it accelerated once she was outside the strict scrutiny of her royal in-laws. Yet her trials were far from over. The family she had left behind did not immediately relinquish their hold on her. In Rajput culture, it was considered shameful for a royal widow to roam freely among commoners, especially in the company of male ascetics. Some accounts assert that the Sisodias sent messengers, even armed forces, to find her and bring her back, forcibly if necessary. Others say that a portion of her paternal family from Merta also worried about her reputation and tried to intervene. But Mirabai had already crossed a threshold, and her mind was set on merging with the flow of divine love. In this period of wandering, Mirabai faced scorn, ridicule, and potential harm from those who did not understand her path. She had relinquished her wealth, her regal attire, and the customary privileges that came with being a Rajput princess. Often travelling in the garb of a simple devotee, she might have mingled with merchants, villagers, beggars, and other pilgrims. The bright spot in this tumult was her sense of inner freedom. At last, she could sing the name of Krishna in public spaces without the constant condemnation of the palace. She could dance in ecstatic devotion in ways that once seemed scandalous in the confines of royal halls. Still, the risk of danger loomed large, and she was occasionally forced to hide or rely on the goodwill of strangers. One day, under the shade of a grand peepal tree, she may have paused with a group of travelling sadhus who recognized her as the Mirabai of Chittorgarh. Over a humble meal, they would share stories of other saints, of near-miraculous experiences of devotion, and of the spiritual wonders found in Vrindavan. Mirabai's face would glow at the mention of Vrindavan, the land where Krishna had danced with the gopis, playing his flute by the banks of the Yamuna. She felt a magnetic pull toward that sacred place. Some sadhus described how the forests of Vrindavan still echoed with the spiritual vibrations of the Lord's name, how countless devotees flocked there to seek Krishna's divine presence. This fueled Mirabai's determination to reach Vrindavan, to roam those forests as though searching for the footprints of her beloved. But the road was long, dotted with towns and villages. Even as she travelled, Mirabai's name continued to spread. Everywhere she went, she would sing, be it in small shrines or simply as she walked. People began memorizing her verses, passing them along orally. The affectionate tone of her poetry, its seamless blending of romantic and spiritual longing, stirred people's hearts. A recurring theme in her songs was the longing for the divine. Take, for instance, these lines from one of her compositions. I wander in search of you, my dark-hued one, clutching your name like a garland of tears. Where is your flute that calls the soul? Where is the forest that hides your feet? O Sham, do not hide from the one who loves you. My nights pass in flames of yearning. By threading together such images of longing and surrender, Mirabai carved out a linguistic space where human love and divine love intertwined. Unlike some other bhakti poets who criticized temple rituals or formalistic religion, Mirabai was not overtly polemical. Her rebellion lay in living the life of a devotee who recognized no social strictures when it came to worship. She carried forward the inclusivity of the bhakti movement by demonstrating her willingness to engage with devotees of all backgrounds. As she proceeded on her journey, word reached her that her paternal relatives were also discontented. They lamented that she was tarnishing the reputation of the Rathore clan. Some suggested that she should be taken back to Merta and placed in a secure environment until she agreed to live as a proper widow. Others suggested more extreme measures reminiscent of the earlier attempts at assassination recounted in the palace legends. For her part, Mirabai placed her trust in Krishna. She had, in essence, become a woman for whom worldly ties paled before the luminosity of spiritual love. In some stories, there is a dramatic interlude in which Mirabai returned briefly to Merta to visit the temple of Charabhuja, a form of Vishnu, or to attend to family matters. She was confronted by relatives who tried to confine her, but she found a way to escape. The details vary, but the narrative thread remains consistent. Mirabai would not be deterred from her quest to live in devotion. A poignant tale from this period speaks of Mirabai arriving at a village where she encountered a small community of devotees who had never seen a female saint of her stature. They invited her to sing in the local temple. That night, Mirabai's voice rang through the simple structure, transporting villagers to realms of divine rapture. Adults wept, children sat in awe, and the local pandit declared that a true gopi of Krishna had graced their village. When Mirabai left in the early hours of the next morning, the villagers found footprints dusted in the temple courtyard, which they garlanded with flowers, believing that the saint's presence had sanctified their place of worship. Such anecdotes flourished wherever Mirabai went, weaving a tapestry of legends that enhanced her reputation as an incarnation of devotion itself. Simultaneously, the tensions with her in-laws and paternal kin continued to simmer. Some versions tell of how her brother-in-law, one of Rana Sanga's successors, possibly Rana Vikramaditya or others, might have dispatched soldiers to detain her. Fearing for her safety, Mirabai had to rely on the kindness of local rulers or devotees who hid her from harm. These episodes underscore the radical nature of her stance in that era. For a woman of royal birth to move about so freely, following an inner calling that disregarded patriarchal dictates, was nearly unthinkable. But Mirabai's devotion was unstoppable, and eventually she found her way to Vrindavan. This arrival is described in many hagiographic accounts as a moment of great spiritual significance. The dust of Vrindavan, it was said, contained the memory of Krishna's pastimes. Every pebble, every tree, carried the vibration of the Lord's presence. Mirabai is said to have bowed down, touched her forehead to the ground, and wept with gratitude. She felt that her years of longing had culminated in setting foot on this sacred soil, the very stage of Krishna's youthful sports with Radha and the gopis. Yet Vrindavan was not merely an idol, it was also a bustling pilgrimage town. Temples, ashrams, and renunciants of various sects populated its winding streets. Mirabai continued to draw attention there, given that she was a woman alone. Some ascetics accepted her wholeheartedly, moved by her sincerity, while others questioned her motivations or disapproved of her public singing and dancing. The cultural norms, even among renunciants, could be quite conservative regarding women's participation in religious gatherings. There is a famous anecdote, though likely apocryphal, where she attempted to visit the ashram of a prominent saint who refused to see women. Mirabai's response was a gentle but profound rebuke. In Vrindavan, I believed Krishna was the only man. Are the rest of us not gopis? Upon hearing this, the saint recognized her spiritual stature and welcomed her in. Whether historically accurate or not, the story highlights Mirabai's conviction that Krishna alone is the ultimate Purusha, divine male principle, and all souls, regardless of gender, are like the feminine principle, gopi seeking union with the beloved. During her time in Vrindavan, she would have had opportunities to study sacred texts, interact with Vaishnava teachers, and immerse herself in kirtans. She composed even more songs celebrating the Leela, divine play, of Krishna and Radha, infusing them with her personal yearning. Some of these compositions are heavily symbolic, blending references to Radha's waiting for Krishna with Mirabai's own sense of separation and union. Consider these lines. When will the flute's call dispel my night? I wait under the Kadamba tree, heart trembling in hope. Beloved, the moon rises and sets, but you do not appear. I dance alone, lost in your name, while the world sleeps. Each moment is a century, each breath a note of longing. Come, my Lord, and turn my tears into a nectar tide. Such verses resonated deeply with the ethos of Vrindavan, where Krishna is perceived as the eternal lover, and devotees see themselves as the waiting beloved. The synergy between Mirabai's devotion and the atmosphere of Vrindavan must have been electrifying, for both she and the land were dedicated to Krishna's remembrance. Yet Mirabai's presence in Vrindavan did not erase the external threats entirely. The Sisodia and Rathore families did not merely forget her. In some accounts, envoys arrived, urging her to return, or at least abide by certain norms. Depending on the version, Mirabai might have even been summoned back to Mewar or to Merta in attempts to either reconcile or forcibly confine her. Each time, she refused to bow to such external pressures. In one of her poems, she references the futility of worldly claims on her life. They call me back to the shadows of walls and duties, They bind me with threads of shame and fear, but I have torn those nets with one name, Krishna. Let them scorn or threaten, I have no kingdom but his feet. To outsiders, it might have seemed that Mirabai was reckless, endangering herself and defying social structures that were centuries old. But to devotees, she exemplified the highest form of spiritual courage, giving up every worldly tie for the sake of divine love. In the process, she also gave voice to the voiceless yearnings of countless women who felt trapped by patriarchal customs. Her poems, transmitted orally, would eventually offer solace to those who found themselves at odds with society's demands. Over the generations, Mirabai became an icon not only of devotional fervor, but of spiritual feminism, a woman who lived her truth in the face of intense opposition. As time passed, Mirabai became a fixture in Vrindavan, joining the spiritual circuits that led devotees to Mathura, Govardhan, Barsana, and other places associated with Krishna's lila. She sang in temples, performed nightly kirtans, and sometimes disappeared for days on solitary wanderings. People recognized her as a saint who had merged her identity with that of a gopi, calling Krishna by names such as Girdhar, Shyam, Govind. Her songs reveal a deepening sense of union, suggesting that her separation from Krishna was turning into a realization of his constant presence. I closed my eyes, and he was there, more intimate than my own breath. In the swirl of the Yamuna's waters, I feel his dancing form. In the rustle of leaves, I hear his laughter. My friend, separation was but an illusion. He was in my heartbeat all along. And yet, even this sense of spiritual attainment did not bring an end to worldly strife. Vrindavan was a microcosm of the broader society. It had its own politics, factions, and gatekeepers. A woman roaming freely, revered by the masses, challenged certain orthodoxies. Consequently, Mirabai may have also received criticism from ascetic communities or temple heads who preferred a more hierarchical approach to worship. Occasionally, Mirabai might have taken refuge with like-minded saints or traveled to other regions, such as Varanasi, sometimes referred to in legends, or even Dwarka in Gujarat, a place also deeply associated with Krishna. The synergy of devotion found in each sacred site nourished her soul, but no single earthly place could quell her longing, for her true desire was a permanent union with Krishna. In the eyes of local devotees, Mirabai glowed with the aura of the Sakhis and Gopis who once played with Krishna in the divine forest. Many came to see her as more than a mere mortal, interpreting her unwavering love and miraculous escapes from danger as signs of divine grace. She remained humble, consistently directing any praise back to Krishna. If someone knelt before her, asking for a blessing, she would say, "I am but a maidservant of Girdhar. If he blesses you, that is all that matters." This humility, combined with her unwavering devotion, further elevated her status among commoners and devotees alike. Letters occasionally arrived from her in-laws or her paternal family, whether threatening or pleading, but she entrusted them to Krishna, quite literally placing them before her idol and seeking guidance in prayer. She composed new songs that recounted her travails, the impossibility of worldly requests, and the futility of returning to a house that was never truly her home. A well-known refrain from this period goes, "My home is at the feet of Giridhari. I have no father, mother, brother, or spouse. The ties of blood have withered in the heat of devotion. Only his flute echoes in the courtyard of my heart." Through such lines, Mirabai communicated her renunciation of not just her marital ties, but of all familial roles that did not serve her spiritual quest. It was a stance both radical and poignant, as in traditional Rajput society, family bonds were sacrosanct. She was severing those bonds for what she saw as a higher calling, a spiritual destiny that could not accommodate the constraints of lineage-based identity. Among the pilgrims and devotees, tales spread far and wide about this regal saint who had forsaken her palace for the love of the blue-hued god. Some said she was an incarnation of Radha. Others believed she was a gifted poet whose verses contained the power to awaken dormant faith. Regardless of the interpretation, Mirabai's presence became a phenomenon that transcended immediate geography. Throughout this process, she also remained acutely aware of the broader currents of bhakti that shaped her era. The Nirguna-Saguna tensions occasionally surfaced, with some saints emphasizing a formless god and decrying idol worship. Mirabai, while personally devoted to a form, Krishna, did not denounce the teachings of Nirguna saints. She saw them as paths converging on the same ultimate truth. Her own guru, in many narratives, was Ravidas, a Nirguna poet who emphasized inner purity and the omnipresence of the divine. Reconciling these viewpoints in her heart, Mirabai concluded that Krishna was both within form and beyond form, that worshipping him as Shyam or Govind was a stepping stone to the formless reality that embraced the entire cosmos. Her songs sometimes reflect this unity. Name and form are but curtains on the stage of truth. Lift them, and you see the boundless Lord. I sing of Krishna, yet know he is all-pervading, as close as the pulse in my wrist, as vast as the silent sky. By integrating these insights into her music, Mirabai attracted followers from multiple strands of bhakti. Some were devout Vaishnavas who adored Krishna's form, others belonged to sant communities that championed the formless. In Mirabai's unwavering love, they saw a reflection of the devotion that crosses all sectarian divides. However, such universal acceptance did not spare her from scorn. She remained a target for those who believed her path undermined social order. The very notion of a woman wandering freely, commanding respect usually reserved for male ascetics, flew in the face of patriarchal norms. Stories circulated that she danced in public, sometimes even in the presence of men, an act considered shameful for a woman of her birth. Yet those who witnessed her dancing described it as a trance-like state of divine ecstasy, an expression of the soul's union with the beloved, devoid of any worldly impropriety. At times, conflict escalated into open threats. There are accounts of men arriving with instructions to abduct her or harm her, only to find themselves inexplicably disarmed by her serenity or physically prevented by a series of unlikely coincidences. One legend recounts that when a group of armed men approached her during kirtan, they were suddenly overcome by a dizziness or blindness that dissipated only after they dropped their weapons and bowed before Krishna's idol. Such stories, whether literal or metaphorical, conveyed the sense that Mirabai was divinely protected, that any attempt to force her back into worldly constraints would fail in the face of her unwavering devotion. Among her many trials, perhaps the greatest was the persistent longing that consumed her every breath. Even as she roamed sacred sites, she felt the pangs of separation from Krishna, who, to her, was more real than any earthly presence. While she sang of oneness and the reassurance of Krishna's proximity, she also sang of the sweet agony of waiting for full communion. Many of her verses paint this paradoxical blend of union and separation, a hallmark of the highest forms of bhakti, where the devotee simultaneously experiences God's presence and yearns for an even deeper unveiling. I see your face in every passerby, yet I yearn to cradle your feet in my clasped hands. My heart leaps like a fish out of water, craving the ocean of your embrace. How can I bear this love that shatters me to pieces and yet makes me whole in every moment? This sense of perpetual longing, woven with glimpses of divine union, kept Mirabai's voice trembling with passion. Her songs moved all who heard them, whether they were princes or paupers. And slowly, a silent revolution took hold in the hearts of many women who saw in Mirabai a validation of their own yearning for spiritual freedom. If a Rajput princess could abandon her gold and honor to become Krishna's bride, perhaps they too had the right to seek God on their own terms. Thus, episode 3 of Mirabai's biography finds her traversing a landscape of devotion and danger, seeking refuge in sacred places, but never fully escaping the repercussions of her social defiance. She has stepped into her role as a wandering minstrel of Krishna's love, a poet whose compositions unify and inspire people across caste and creed. The external conflicts mirror her inner search, a search that leads her through the torment of separation. the thrill of glimpsed union, and the unwavering conviction that her entire existence belongs to Krishna alone. Episode 4. Revelations under the sky of bhakti. By the time Mirabai's wanderings had solidified her reputation throughout the northern regions, she was no mere curiosity. She was recognized as one of the foremost poet-saints of her era, her name spoken in the same reverential tones as Kabir, Ravidas, Surdas, and others who had illuminated the path of devotion. This was not only a result of her personal charisma and striking life story, but also because her songs were widely circulated by traveling minstrels, devotees, and scribes who found her verses to be rich in spiritual depth and emotional appeal. Though the label Bhakti movement suggests a monolithic wave of devotion, the reality was far more variegated. Bhakti encompassed numerous lineages, philosophies, and practices, some worshipping Vishnu or his incarnations, others adoring Shiva, and still others focusing on the formless Brahman. In Mirabai's circle, Krishna was the irresistible magnet, the divine flute player who stirred souls into ecstasy. Yet she was neither sectarian nor dogmatic. She had discovered an inner revelation. Love alone was the bridge between the human and the divine. Mirabai's spiritual worldview was deeply shaped by what she had seen of the Nirguna Sant tradition, especially in her possible connection with Ravidas. But her songs remained unabashedly saguna, calling upon Krishna in intimate, personal terms. During this period, Mirabai is said to have engaged in dialogues with other prominent saints. Some accounts claim she interacted with Vallabhacharya or his followers, who are key figures in the Pushtimarg tradition of Krishna devotion centered in Braj. Whether or not these meetings took place historically, the textual overlap between her poetry and certain aspects of Vallabhacharya's teaching suggests a shared milieu of Krishna-centered devotion. Pushtimarg emphasized the grace of Krishna, the sweetness of the Leela, and a personal connection with the Lord, all resonating strongly with Mirabai's stance. If such exchanges occurred, they would have likely deepened her understanding of the theology that underpinned her devotion, reinforcing her sense that singing the Lord's praises was both a form of worship and a means of direct communion. Amidst these spiritual explorations, Mirabai also faced the lingering shadows of social conflict. The world of the 16th century was not kind to a woman who defied patriarchal norms so brazenly. At times, she may have found relative peace and acceptance in certain pockets of devotion, only to be forced to move on when a new wave of hostility or misunderstanding arose. Yet far from being a bleak road of ceaseless adversity, her path was illumined by profound spiritual realizations, moments in which she felt Krishna's presence so vividly that all suffering melted away in the warmth of his love. In these epiphanic moments, Mirabai's poetry soared to new heights. She wrote of the Lord dwelling within her own heart, erasing the distinction between the lover and the beloved. Lines like these capture the essence of that unity. I sought you in temple and shrine, travelled wide, called out your name. In each step, I lost a bit of myself, until I found you glowing in my own heart. O Swami, the distance was but an illusion. You and I have been one from the start. Such verses took root in the consciousness of ordinary people, who found solace and inspiration in her ability to articulate the inexpressible. The Bhakti movement, by its very nature, appealed to both learned scholars and simple villagers, offering a direct route to God through the universal language of love. Mirabai's songs, couched in the everyday idiom of Braj Bhasha or Rajasthani, bridged the gap between courtly Sanskrit traditions and the vernacular tongues of the masses. Through her words, the villagers of rural Rajasthan and Braj could feel that their devotion mattered, that they too could approach Krishna as intimately as a gopi longing for her beloved. One day, during her time in Vrindavan, she is said to have had a profound vision. While meditating near the banks of the Yamuna, she sensed Krishna's presence in the soft rustling of the leaves and the gentle waves upon the water's surface. A sudden rush of ecstasy overcame her, and for a moment she felt herself transported to the cosmic dance, Ras Leela, where Krishna and the gopis danced under the full moon. Merging into that vision, she tasted the bliss of divine love, where time and space dissolved, and nothing remained but the enchanting interplay of the soul with the supreme. When she returned to ordinary consciousness, tears streamed down her face, and she penned a poem describing this rapture. In the moon's silver circle, I joined the divine circle. My anklets chimed in rhythm to the flute's call. I am no longer this or that. I am the dance itself, lost in the swirl of eternal love. Oh, friend, how can I speak of that ecstasy? My lips can only tremble with his name, Krishna. Such accounts of mystical union abound in the hagiographies of Mirabai, underscoring her identity as not just a devotee, but a mystic of the highest order. Yet she did not retire into an inner cave of solitude after experiencing these states. On the contrary, she continued to share her devotion in public song and dance, embodying the bhakti ideal that the personal experience of God is not reserved for an elite few, but is accessible to all who yearn with sincerity. Over the months and years, her footprints extended beyond Vrindavan. Some narratives describe a journey to Dwarka, the sacred city on the western coast of Gujarat, believed to be the kingdom of Krishna in his royal manifestation. It was a long and arduous route, crossing deserts and plains, but Mirabai was determined to visit every significant place associated with her beloved lord. Along the way, she stopped in villages, performed kirtans in local temples, and offered comfort to those who sought her guidance. By now, she had matured into a figure of maternal love and compassion for fellow devotees. If once she had been the rebellious princess, by this stage she was recognized widely as a saint who bore the fragrance of divine grace. Dwarka, perched on the edge of the Arabian Sea, has a powerful magnetism for Krishna devotees because it is revered as the city where Krishna established his kingdom after leaving Mathura. The temple of Dwarkadish stands as a testimony to his regal aspect. Mirabai's arrival here, according to legend, was marked by an outpouring of devotion from local Vaishnavas who had heard of her fame. She gazed upon the towering temple spires, bowed in reverence, and offered her entire being to the deity within, known as Dwarkadish, King of Dwarka. Some say she spent extended periods here, absorbed in meditative states, occasionally lost in trance as she contemplated Krishna's Leela in his royal form. However, even in Dwarka, she could not escape the notice of those who believed her place was in the confines of her paternal or marital home. Delegations were dispatched to bring her back. At times, the local authorities might have faced pressure to hand her over, but Mirabai's aura and the protective sentiment of the devotees around her often thwarted such efforts. Many believed it would be a grave sin to harm a saint of her caliber. Meanwhile, letters arrived, either from Mirta or Chittagong, oscillating between censure and pleas for her return. She is said to have replied only with poems or brief notes, always emphasizing that her sole allegiance was to Krishna. In the hush of twilight, on the windswept coast of Dwarka, Mirabai composed verses that blended the vastness of the ocean with the infinite love she felt. One such fragment runs, "The ocean roars your name as it kisses the shore. Endless waves mirror my endless longing. I stand upon the sands, calling you with each breath. Sea foam drapes my feet like a bridal veil. O Dwarkadish, the horizon melts into the sky, and my heart melts into you." These lines illustrate her continued use of natural imagery to evoke spiritual meaning. Whether it was the Yamuna in Vrindavan or the ocean in Dwarka, Mirabai perceived Krishna's presence in the rhythms of nature, affirming the Sant tradition's insight that the divine pulses through every corner of creation. Despite her growing circle of devotees, Mirabai remained vulnerable to the prejudices of the time. Some critics sneered at her emotionalism, claiming that women were too fickle or impure to access true spiritual knowledge. Others suggested that her flamboyant singing and dancing were unseemly, yet for every detractor there were countless admirers who saw in her a living embodiment of devotion. Women, in particular, found hope in her example. They glimpsed a path where one's love for God could overcome societal constraints, a path that recognized no barrier of caste or gender. Mirabai's compassion also extended to the downtrodden. She would feed the hungry whenever she had the means, or comfort the sick, insisting that Krishna was present in every living being. Such service was not a formal philanthropic project, but a spontaneous expression of her heart. For Mirabai, every act of compassion was an offering to Krishna. This stance reflected a broader bhakti principle, that active service to others is inseparable from devotion to God. Perhaps she had learned or been inspired by the teachings of saints like Ravidas, who championed the equality of all souls and the vanity of social discrimination. Throughout these travels, Mirabai's resilience became legendary. Whether in desert heat or monsoon rains, she pressed forward, relying on scant food and shelter, trusting that Krishna would provide what was necessary. When she sang, her voice seemed to draw an invisible canopy of grace over her, as if the very cosmos resonated with her calls of Giridhari, Giridhari. Passers-by who witnessed her devotion were often reduced to tears, feeling inexplicably moved. Some believed they glimpsed Krishna himself dancing beside her, though such visions may have been metaphorical expressions of the bhav, devotional emotion, that enveloped her. At this juncture, Mirabai had become a rallying figure in the pantheon of bhakti saints. Minstrels carried her songs, weaving them into oral traditions alongside the verses of Surdas, Kabir, and Tulsidas. Local scribes began compiling collections of her poems, though systematic preservation of her works would not take shape until much later. Yet no matter how widespread her fame, Mirabai herself seemed untouched by pride or vanity. She viewed every accolade as rightfully belonging to Krishna. Once, when asked how she felt about being so well known, she might have replied with a verse such as, "What name do I have but Krishna's own? When they praise me, they praise the one who sings in my heart. I am just a reed in his flute, hollow and waiting, he breathes, and the music is born." Such lines encapsulate her complete self-effacement and her conviction that her poetic gifts were instruments of divine will. Indeed, many of the Bhakti saints shared this sentiment, attributing their compositions to God's inspiration rather than their own skill or intelligence. In this pivotal chapter of her life, Mirabai's journey across sacred centers and her deepening mystical experiences converged to forge the legacy we now recount centuries later. She had faced familial wrath, social ostracism, physical threats, and spiritual trials. Through it all, her devotion only intensified, burning away any illusions of duality between herself and Krishna. In her songs, she conveyed not only the torment of separation, but also the ineffable sweetness of union, inspiring generations of devotees to taste the nectar of surrender. Thus, Episode 4 of Mirabai's story is one of revelations. Moving through Vrindavan, Dwarka, and countless hamlets in between, she discovered that devotion could thrive in any climate, under any circumstance. The sky of bhakti stretched across caste, creed, and geography, offering shelter to those who sang the Lord's name with pure intent. Mirabai, born a Rajput princess, had transformed into a servant of Krishna, whose life was a continuous pilgrimage of the heart. As she pressed forward, the clarion call of her poetry beckoned others to follow, proving that even in a world fraught with turmoil, the soul's highest destiny, to love God unconditionally, remains an unassailable truth. Episode 5. Into the Arms of the Beloved. Legends converge around the final chapters of Mirabai's life, painting images of her eventual acceptance within certain communities of devotees and her continued estrangement from worldly ties. By this stage, somewhere in the early to mid-1500s, India's political landscape was undergoing major shifts. The Mughal Empire under Babur, and later Humayun and Akbar, was extending its influence across large swathes of the subcontinent. Rajput kingdoms, including Mewar, were grappling with the complexities of alliances, warfare, and diplomacy. Amid these historical currents, Mirabai's purely devotional quest stood in stark contrast. While armies clashed over territory and power, she roamed in search of Krishna's presence, oblivious to the grand struggles that so obsessed the ruling elites. Whether residing briefly in Dwarka, Vrindavan, or traveling elsewhere, Mirabai's sense of belonging was rooted in Krishna's name alone. Some accounts indicate that her paternal uncle or cousin attempted one last time to reconcile with her, proposing that she return to Merta and live in a special quarters set aside for prayer. They promised to support her devotion if only she would rejoin the family fold. But Mirabai knew that such arrangements would bind her again in domestic obligations. She refused, stating that she already had a home in Krishna. Her family, weary of pursuing her, may have finally relented, resigning themselves to the reality that Mirabai's destiny lay beyond the structures of Rajput society. Her daily routine now consisted of rising before dawn, bathing in a river or well if available, then performing japa, repetition of God's name, and kirtan until daylight. She ate whatever food came her way, often minimal, sometimes provided by other devotees who felt blessed to share a meal with her. Throughout the day, she composed or sang new verses, taught local women the art of singing bhajans, devotional songs, and conversed with anyone who sought spiritual counsel. In the evenings, she joined communal gatherings of kirtan, where the chanting of Krishna's name would crescendo into ecstasy. At night, she slept on a simple mat, her idol of Krishna by her side. In these final years, Mirabai's poetry took on a tone of imminent union, as though she sensed that her sojourn on earth was approaching its close. Her longing matured from a desperate search for Krishna to an almost serene acceptance of his constant companionship. She wrote, "I ran after your shadow through birth after birth, only to discover you held me in your arms all along. Now my mind has quieted like a child in its mother's lap. I know no thirst, for your love fills every pore." Such lines suggest a deepening realization of the Lord's omnipresence, diminishing the agony of separation she once felt so acutely. While her earlier poems exult in the fire of viraha, separation, her later ones breathe the calm air of Milan, union. This shift, characteristic of many mystics, marks the inward culmination of her spiritual journey. One of the most cherished legends surrounding Mirabai's departure from this world unfolds in Dwarka. According to this account, her last days were spent in unwavering devotion at the Dwarkadish temple. A rumor reached her that the Sisodia clan had once again pressed demands that she return or face consequences. Tired of conflict, she approached the sanctum of Dwarkadish one evening, her heart brimming with a final plea. She prayed fervently, addressing Krishna. "If the world will not let your servant be, then release me into you. I can no longer bear this separation, nor the strife it causes others. Beloved, take me into your eternal embrace." As the story goes, Mirabai danced in the temple that night, lost in ecstatic union. When the music ceased and the other devotees looked for her, they found only her garments at the foot of Krishna's idol. The saint herself had vanished, absorbed into the image of her Lord. This tale, while seemingly miraculous, captures the essence of her life, a soul so completely surrendered to Krishna that physical existence dissolved in his presence. Such a narrative mirrors the accounts of other saints who are said to have dematerialized or merged with the divine, an idea central to many spiritual traditions that revere unity with God as the ultimate goal. Historians often approach this legend with caution, suggesting that the story serves as a hagiographic motif rather than a literal record of her final moments. Some propose that Mirabai may have passed away quietly, perhaps cremated or buried according to local customs, and that the story of her merging with the idol symbolizes the culmination of her spiritual union. Yet, to her devotees, the tradition remains alive, that Mirabai was physically taken into Krishna's image as a testament to her unprecedented devotion. In any case, the consensus is that she left her mortal coil around 1546 or 1547, though dates vary. What remains indisputable is that by the mid-16th century, Mirabai's poetry and saintly persona had already entered the collective memory of the region. Oral recitations, temple gatherings, and written compilations ensured that her name lived on, shining among the brightest lights of the bhakti movement. The once timid princess of Merta, who became a royal daughter-in-law in Mewar, had traversed a labyrinth of trials, widowhood, persecution, near assassination attempts, and relentless social censure, only to emerge as an immortal figure of devotion. In the immediate years following her departure, devotees continued to share and preserve her songs. Scribes in Rajasthan and Braj wrote down versions of her bhajans, though these manuscripts varied in accuracy and completeness. Over time, her verses spread throughout Gujarat, Maharashtra, and even further south, translated and adapted by local communities who resonated with her theme of absolute surrender to God. In the realm of Indian devotional literature, Mirabai's verses are cherished for their lyrical simplicity, their emotional power, and their universal message. The Lord is yours, if only you love him with every fiber of your being. Thus, Episode 5 offers a portrait of Mirabai's last stages of life, a saint dwelling in outward simplicity but inwardly rich with union. Through the lens of hagiography, we see the final resolution of her longings in that climactic merging with Krishna at Dwarka. Through a more historical lens, we see a woman forging a legacy that would endure for centuries. Either way, the essence remains. Mirabai's spirit found rest in the beloved, leaving behind a legacy that continues to inspire those who seek the infinite within the finite bounds of earthly existence. Episode 6. Legacy of the Nightingale of Bhakti. Mirabai's impact on Indian devotional culture is both immediate and enduring. Even in her lifetime, her name was spoken with reverence by common folk, wandering ascetics, and fellow saints. Her compositions, though orally transmitted and subject to variations, emerged as a staple of bhakti kirtans across North India. In subsequent generations, singers and scholars compiled anthologies of her poems, often referred to as Mirapada or Mirabhajans, incorporating them into the living corpus of Vaishnava hymnody. Today, one can scarcely enter a temple or attend a satsang, devotional gathering, in India without hearing at least one of her songs. The continuing resonance of Mirabai's poetry stems from its directness, emotional depth, and unwavering focus on the personal bond with Krishna. While many bhakti poets wrote exquisite verses, Mirabai's vantage point as a woman defying her royal status and conjugal ties adds a distinctive poignancy. Her poems traverse a wide emotional spectrum, from the heartbreak of separation, viraha, to the ecstasy of union, milan, from raw cries of despair to serene declarations of unity. They speak to the universal human quest for love and fulfillment, using Krishna as both the outer beloved and the inner divine essence. Moreover, Mirabai's life story occupies a special place in India's cultural memory as a testament to the possibility of spiritual autonomy, even in the face of patriarchal constraints. She is often revered not just by devotees of Krishna, but by anyone who admires a fearless woman who followed her heart's calling. Her image, clad in simple attire, holding the ektara, a one-stringed musical instrument, or sometimes depicted gracefully dancing to her own song, has become iconic. Popular retellings of her biography, whether in poems, plays, films, or television serials, inevitably highlight her courage and devotion, ensuring that each new generation encounters her story. In discussing Mirabai's intellectual legacy, it is crucial to note that while she was not a theologian in the formal sense, her poetry contains profound theological insights. She articulates the nature of grace, the immediacy of God's presence, and the futility of external rituals devoid of heartfelt love. She also implicitly critiques the rigidity of caste and gender norms by foregrounding devotion as the supreme criterion for spiritual worth. In doing so, she echoes and contributes to the broader Sant tradition, wherein purity of heart supersedes social distinctions. This radical inclusivity resonates with modern readers who seek a spiritual path unbounded by orthodoxy or hierarchy. Though Mirabai is predominantly grouped with the Saguna poets for her adoration of Krishna's form, her songs occasionally dissolve into near-nirguna statements, particularly those that speak of the formless essence behind Krishna's playful form. These moments underscore the fluid nature of bhakti in her era, where devotion was not always neatly categorized into with form or formless. Mirabai exemplifies how a devotee can worship a personal deity while acknowledging the deity's ultimate transcendence of name and form. Historically, her timeline places her in an era dominated by vast political shifts and religious reconfigurations. The establishment of Mughal power in North India and the eventual reign of Akbar coincided with growing interactions between different religious communities. The Bhakti movement had multiple offshoots, including the Sikh tradition in Punjab, founded by Guru Nanak, 1469 to 1539, and various Vaishnava sects that found patronage in different courts. Mirabai's legacy might be understood, in part, as a bridging of the old feudal world of Rajput chivalry and the newer religious currents that emphasized individual devotion over social or ritual constraints. Her story reveals how the fervor for Krishna devotion transcended the boundaries of clan, court, and lineage, carrying an egalitarian promise of divine love for all. Beyond India, in modern times, Mirabai's poetry has been translated into numerous languages, captivating Western audiences intrigued by mysticism, feminism, and devotional literature. Writers, poets, and spiritual seekers across the globe have quoted her verses, drawn by their poignant simplicity and universal longing for the divine. She has thus come to represent an archetype of the ecstatic female mystic, comparable in certain respects to figures like Saint Teresa of Avila in Christian mysticism or Rabia al-Basri in Sufi Islam, women whose passion for God shattered the confines of their cultural milieus. In the context of the Nirguna Bhakti movement or Sant tradition that the question seeks to highlight, Mirabai's contribution is distinctive. Though her central devotional focus is the form of Krishna, the spirit of her devotion eschews narrow social codifications. She embodies one of the central thrusts of the Sant tradition, that love of God stands supreme above social, familial, or ritualistic obligations. Her respect for saints like Ravidas, who was from a marginalized caste background, underscores her sant-like dismissal of caste-based prejudice. Hence, while historically labeled as a Saguna Bhakta, Mirabai's heart carried the universal flame of bhakti that unites Nirguna and Saguna under the larger umbrella of direct, unmediated love for the divine. Contemporary gatherings often feature her bhajans rendered in classical ragas, semi-classical styles, or even modern interpretations. Singers such as Lata Mangeshkar and Kishori Amonkar, among countless others, have performed her poems, bridging the gap between folk spirituality and sophisticated musical traditions. The emotional resonance of her verses remains undiminished, capable of stirring tears in the eyes of devotees and connoisseurs alike. One of the reasons her poetry endures is its emphasis on the human dimension of divine love. The longing she expresses, the sense of heartbreak, and sometimes playful complaint to Krishna, all these mirror the emotional arcs of human relationships. By projecting human love onto the divine plane, Mirabai creates an immediacy that devotional aspirants find relatable. The archetype of Radha and Krishna's love, with its blend of separation and union, heartbreak and fulfillment, becomes a cosmic allegory for every soul's quest for union with God. Mirabai taps into this archetype but infuses it with her personal story, thus universalizing her personal devotion for generations to come. Moreover, her life testifies to the possibility of living according to the dictates of one's soul, even in a staunchly patriarchal environment. She did not produce tracts or manifestos on social reform. She simply lived her conviction that Krishna was her eternal spouse and that no one had the authority to separate her from him. By singing her truth in open courtyards, temples, and palaces, she exposed the vulnerabilities of a society that sought to confine women to narrowly prescribed roles. Centuries later, feminists and social reformers would look back on her life as an example of individual agency triumphing over oppressive norms. While hagiographic elements undoubtedly color Mirabai's narrative, the core facts remain striking and influential. She was born around 1498 into a Rajput family, married into the Sisodia clan, defied societal expectations, composed numerous devotional songs, wandered in search of Krishna, and likely died around 1547 or thereabouts. The legendary tales of her survival against poison, her miraculous merges into temples or idols, and her run-ins with male ascetics refusing to see a woman all serve to highlight the exceptional quality of her devotion. Whether every event is literal or symbolic, the impetus behind these stories is to convey how absolute love for God can overcome mortal dangers, social hierarchies, and even the limitations of the physical body. In the broader tapestry of the bhakti tradition, Mirabai stands as one of its brightest threads, a thread woven from the golden hues of surrender, longing, and unbreakable spiritual resolve. Alongside Kabir's radical monotheism, Surdas's elaborate descriptions of Krishna's childhood, Tulsidas's devotion to Rama, and other luminaries of the era, Mirabai's voice brought a distinctly feminine register to the symphony of devotion. She introduced an element of personal romance with the divine, bridging the approach of Radha's love for Krishna into an individualized expression that contemporary listeners and readers can still access. Hence, as we conclude this biography in 6 episodes, we can say that Mirabai's life is best understood not as a linear tale with a neat beginning, middle, and end, but as an ongoing love story that continues to unfold whenever her songs are sung, whenever a devotee feels that irrepressible surge of longing for God. From her childhood fascination with Krishna's idol, through her tumultuous marriage and widowhood, to her exile from royal life, and finally to her mystical absorption in the beloved, Mirabai walked a path of unwavering dedication that still kindles the hearts of all who read or hear her words. The Nightingale of Bhakti, as she is often called, continues to sing across time. Her voice can be heard in the early morning hours in temple courtyards, in late-night gatherings where sadhus chant around a fire, and in the solitary hush of a seeker's heart. Mira Ka Prabhu Giridhar Nagar, as she often referred to Krishna, remains the refrain of many a devotional ensemble. And each time her poetry is recited, the abiding truth of her message radiates forth. The highest calling of a human life is to love and surrender to the divine, for in that timeless bond one discovers the secret of true freedom, joy, and immortality.